Welcome everyone to our second annual COLA Juneteenth commemoration and celebration. I am honored to introduce you all to Dr. Anthony Brown. He is a professor of curriculum and instruction and affiliated faculty in the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. There are two strands to his research. The first strand focuses on the formation of race and racism within the school curriculum. The second strand of research explores how long-term narratives found within social science discourse to limit the type of interventions and policies that can be pursued for African-American males. He has received numerous teaching awards, including the President's Associates Teaching Award and Regent's Outstanding Teaching Award. This year, he served as the chair of the Faculty Council. And Dr. Brown will be giving us a talk today entitled Understanding Juneteenth Celebrations Within the Politics of Race and Memory. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Dr. Brown.
Thank you, Dr. Pikus. Thank you for that kind introduction. I also would like to thank all of the committee members that were involved in putting this event together. I've been here 15 years, and I think I realized this year that there was a Juneteenth event, so hopefully this will be something that I could attend that probably should have been part of what we do every year. So now I'm thrilled to know that there'll be a Juneteenth celebration every year in the College of Liberal Arts. I also would like to thank Mary and Barbara for the invitation and helping with the preparation of this event, and all others that were kind of instrumental in allowing the technology and everything to work to allow this event to be made possible. So I'd like to start today's presentation with reading the proclamation that was offered. Actually, it was an executive order. And on June 19, 1865, federal troops led by Union General Gordon Granger issued what is known as General Order Number 3, which stated, "The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with the proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes between employer and free labor." What I'd like for you to do for a moment, as you say, I'm in the College of Education, so even when I give presentations, I tend to offer some kind of dynamism to my discussion. So I often ask questions to allow us to participate rather than it just be me giving information the whole time. I like to have some interaction with those that are participating in today's events. So I want you to read this for a moment, and I want you to consider the question, how do you think the enslaved Africans of Texas might have responded to this event? Receiving the news, what would they say? So if you take about a minute and put some ideas in the chat, and Blake maybe or Dr. Pikus, we could read or share some of the comments from the participants.
I think it finally is working. I would imagine they had a range of feelings from disbelief, shock, happiness, fear, uncertainty.
Yeah.
Distrust and disbelief. How is this actually going to be implemented? Cautiously optimistic. Joy, uncertainty if their former masters would respect it. Definitely not sure what to do next.
Well, all of those range of emotions were certainly part of the discourse in Galveston and throughout Texas. But the one thing that was noted once the news was received, with a sense of cautious kind of optimism, there was joy and jubilation. There were prayers, there were tears, there was crying. And what this set forth, which would be from that point forward, what are known as freedom celebrations. Freedom celebrations took shape after the Civil War. Sometimes they're called Freedom Day. Scholars noted that emancipation celebrations exploded after the Civil War. These were seen as a moment when communities took special time to commemorate the emancipation from the institution of slavery. Some of them were typical with parades and singing, while some were more somber remembrances of the signing of the emancipation, some with prayers, some with kind of candlelight vigils. The tradition continued through the early 20th century, but in part it diminished in significance as a Freedom Day. But historians note that it was Juneteenth that served as one of the more significant Freedom Day celebrations, serving as, by the late 20th century, the signature space in which the idea of freedom is remembered each and every year. I recall growing up, January 1, there was a kind of acknowledgement or remembrance, but nothing that I had seen until I started visiting Texas. A little personal anecdote, I'm married to a Texan. Some of you may know her. She's a professor here. Her name is Carolyn Brown. She's from Houston, Texas, and we would come here, and I was amazed at the kind of excitement that was given to this celebration. It was without a doubt an African American Texas event, at least within the communities I engaged with in Texas. However, as Carolyn and I traveled at different parts of the country, we knew that we would see Juneteenth celebrations in Massachusetts. We would see Juneteenth celebrations in Minnesota, Wisconsin, California. And the first thing Carolyn would say is, why are they celebrating Juneteenth? There was a possession as if Juneteenth belonged only to Texas. But we are in a different moment now where Juneteenth has become the signature celebration for remembering freedom, the emancipation from the Holocaust of enslavement, as some refer to it. If we can go to the next slide, please. It is this historic moment that has given us an opportunity to celebrate in a very exuberant kind of way through dance, through song. However, I want to emphasize the significance of a freedom celebration such as Juneteenth as being a form of curriculum. I define curriculum as a course of knowledge used to help students engage the world. Curriculum is about memory making, or the way a nation imagines and shapes what people come to know about the past and present. In a society founded on the very notion of racial difference and equality, curriculum is an apparatus that informs the narrative of race in the United States. The degree to which a young person is able to learn about race via the school curriculum inform his or her understandings of race, both its significance and its impact in the present. The racial knowledge informs the present day sociological imagination of students about their own place in a racialized society, whether they're part of the dominant group or a historical underrepresented racial group. And because curriculum has and continues to be embroiled in racial politics and ideological warfare, freedom celebrations are not mere socializing events. They serve as what I call counter memory events. If you can, and we've already a few of the slides advanced, if we can move the slides to, let's see where you're at now. If you can go two more slides. Next one. Next one, right there. So celebrations, I want us to consider celebrations as a curricular and counter memory event. And in the remaining of this presentation, I'll explain what exactly do I mean by a counter memory event. But before I explain the counter, I think it should be appropriate that I explain if something is counter, I have to articulate what is it counter to. And if we can go to the next slide. So in the late 19th century, early 20th century, depictions of this kind were quite common within kind of children's literature. This is taken from what was known as the Coon alphabet. So we're talking about a counter. It was counter to a form of anti-black image making that occurred in the late 19th century, early 20th century, that would prompt this kind of counter information or counter knowledge. This you see D is for Ditmas, which blew down a gun. Now he and his sister, and then there were none. F is for Fatima, who reached for her hat, and now she's done guessing just where she's at. Now, we don't all the way know the historical record how often these were used in schools, but they're seen in libraries, so we have some indication of its circulation. And the person who created the book was the illustrator for Mark Twain, Mark Kimball. So if you look it up, all 26 letters take you through these kind of violent and graphic anti-black depictions, making children look almost demonic and crazed. Death is given by eaten by animals, drowning, limbs being cut off at every part throughout the 26 letters of the alphabet. The next slide, please. This was taken from a book that was published also about late 19th century, early 20th century. There are at least 8 renditions of this book. It was a counting book that was used in places all throughout Europe, even in certain parts of Asia and throughout the United States. Kids would sing songs. The book was called 10 Little N-Words, and you would sing one song and then a boy would die. The 10 little N boys sat down to dine. One choked his little self, and then there were 9. So these kinds of anti-black depictions were unfortunately quite common during the early parts of the 20th century. If you could go to the next slide, please. Now this is taken from a textbook. I don't know if you can make out that. I'm going to read what it says so you could get a sense. So what they were counter to was the idea of centering of whiteness. So I'll read this. You can see right from the title, The Background of American History, The Story of the White Man. This is taken from a textbook, 1951, in circulation right here in Texas. It was very much part of the Texas adopted textbooks in the mid-century. The history of any country is only part of the history of the world. If we're to understand how our own country came into existence, we must know something about those countries from which the people came who settled America. Only a little more than 400 years ago, Columbus discovered the Western Hemisphere. This is a very short time as compared with the history of European countries. In turn, their history is brief as compared with that of Egypt and Western Asia, from which Europeans obtained many of their important ideas. You have already read about the European background of American history, but some time has passed since you studied the subject. This chapter is a brief review of the story of the white man before the discovery of America. It was written to refresh your memories. In it, you'll find maps that will help you locate several of the countries that have made important contributions to the advancement of the white man. Again, I think in this instance, I want you to consider how a child may understand themselves if anything is depicted of them as graphic and mythical in that sense, or there's a centering of whiteness that doesn't privilege your story at all. Go to the next slide, please. And the third way in which you would find information in textbooks or in school knowledge was complete absence or invisibility. No reference to your stories, the things that you experienced, including slavery. The experiences of Jim Crow were little to rarely completely acknowledged. Some of that is because textbooks were often adopted in the context of the politics of the lost cause. Authors such as Lawrence Reddick have written about how the neo-Southern ideology that was embedded in most textbooks. So there were 3 ways in which African Americans were depicted in school and K-12 knowledge: either graphic mythological characterizations where there's gross distortions of who we are, or there is a centering of whiteness that privileges the entire narrative of history or the story of America as a white story, and then African Americans are either absent and invisible. So when I think about celebrations serving as counter to these particular stories, this is what it was counter to. And I want to propose that freedom celebrations such as Juneteenth, and for those of you that are just joining us, my thesis of this talk is that freedom celebrations cannot just simply be seen as socializing events. They were events that sought to challenge the narratives that were told about African Americans, situate knowledge in a particular way that presented the story of African Americans in humanizing ways. If we could go to the next slide, please. So I want to argue that there are at least three ways we can think about freedom celebrations as it relates to counter memory. Providing knowledge about African Americans, foster the process of learning and history in non-traditional ways, and affirm and humanize the experience of African Americans. Next slide, please. So if you've ever been to a Juneteenth event, or what I just call a freedom celebration, when I was growing up in LA, they had these things called Family Day. They were free concerts. You could see Stevie Wonder, the Isley Brothers, and there were moments, and there were books, vendors, and art, and food, and lectures, and every possible thing. The Essence Festival in New Orleans, of those who've attended. So when I think about these notion of freedom celebrations, I'm talking about ways in which knowledge is presented outside of traditional spaces that seek to define and center the experiences of African Americans. And freedom celebrations such as Juneteenth provide knowledge about the history of African Americans that are often not discussed in schools. And the second thing it does by way of providing knowledge, it situates African American stories and histories within the context of the U.S. history narrative. Oftentimes our stories are situated outside of it, a footnote, another course of study. Juneteenth squarely situates the history of Texas and the history of the United States within the narrative of the Civil War and post-Civil War America. Next slide, please. One of the fascinating things about freedom celebrations is it provides a seamless space to learn and express history in different ways. This is not about paper and pencil and quizzes and tests and essays. This is song and dance and poetry and other means to express and learn about your experiences and understand the stories that are in you and being able to express them in different ways. If you recall in the image of the little girls dancing, if you were to go to a freedom celebration of any kind that center the experience of African Americans, you'll see the expression of history in non-traditional ways, which often, unfortunately, rarely occurs in the context of schools. Next slide, please. And most importantly, I would argue that freedom celebrations affirm and humanize the experiences of African Americans. I provide a space to affirm the personhood of people of African descent and African American descent. It addresses our existential experience in the United States in ways that affirm what we look like, what we eat, how our histories are not often affirmed or understood in humanizing ways. And freedom celebrations have a powerful capacity to do that. And in my own experiences with freedom celebrations, they do this exact thing. Next slide, please. If we could cue up this video gives you, it's about a 5-minute or so video, gives us a sense of like how freedom celebrations serve as a counter memory event. So I'll just let it do, and then we'll open it up for discussion.
Juneteenth is a deeply emotional moment for enslaved people because for decades, for centuries, enslaved people prayed for, hoped for, fought for in the form of slave rebellions, running away, bought their freedom when they could. If you read slave narratives, if you listen to spirituals from the era of slavery, you know that enslaved people longed for freedom. This was something that had been hoped for, but many believe may never come.
Well, the master promised to give me $40 a month in fed. Well, lots of the boys say they ain't want it. They rather go free, you know.
Being able to go wherever they wanted, being able to wonder about. For enslaved people, it was an expression of their freedom.
Well, Matt Porter was the one that long Miss Porter, one of our white folks' neighbors. He was coming along, we all sitting on the fence, and a colored soldier come along and asked her did she want to go with him. And she said yes, she might one of them horses. She went on with them. I never did see her and hear tell of her no more.
When I think about Juneteenth, I think about it in the context of Emancipation Day celebrations that began January 1, 1863. They took on a whole new meaning when slavery was formally abolished after 1865. You would have had African-American veterans who fought in the Civil War be prominent in these celebrations, dressed in their military garb, speeches from enslaved people, the most prominent Black politicians singing of hymns, spirituals, discussions of registering to vote. Enslaved people celebrating in public their newfound freedom was an act of resistance. Because we have to remember, slavery came to an end after a 4 years bloody Civil War. Still the bloodiest conflict in American history. Many people in the South and in the nation who did not want to see slavery abolished fought tooth and nail to block the 13th Amendment. The abolition of slavery created a huge humanitarian crisis in the South. Suddenly, 4 million people have very little means to take care of themselves, to support themselves, and do so in a really hostile environment. So the military was necessary to make sure that enslaved people got the food, the medicine, the shelter that they needed in order to survive. They're also there to protect, to the extent that that was possible, freed people from violence, from recriminations, from slaveholders, from Confederates who still hadn't given up the fight.
And I remember, and the Yankees stopped here, and the Yankees stopped right on the corner of the square, and they prosecuting people, you know. We go to the ground field, and they take them, hang them over the slum. That's the punishment they got. Next time you see, they come a whole troop of Yankees, all riding horses. Big guns hanging on. I said, Mama, where are they going? They said, they're all going home now.
When the last federal troops leave the South, it's a signal to Southerners. The federal government wasn't going to put its might into ensuring the civil rights of Black people would be observed. You have 20, 30 years later, Black people being lynched in public, and there isn't a federal anti-lynching law to protect them. In most communities in America, there's a history of lynching and racial violence, and very few communities have marked that, commemorated that. Every decade since the end of slavery, Black people have been more educated, accrued more wealth, more status in American society. Every decade since 1865. But there's been one constant, and that constant is the presence of random racist violence. What I see in George Floyd's murder was a white police officer attempting to dominate and to subdue a black man who was not resisting, who could not resist. Even though slavery came to an end in 1865, the desire to master and dominate black bodies did not. And we have never dealt with that. These are the kinds of stark realities that are highlighted during Juneteenth. If black people's lives can be expunged through racist violence and no one is held accountable, how free are we? Are we free?
So, in watching this video, I want us to consider this question as it relates to K-12 curriculum. Dr. Dinah Berry and Dr. Kathleen Brown and I have a grant. We've been doing work on Texas slavery in the state of Texas, like how it's depicted, what are ways which we could change the narrative, and how we can help teachers do this work. And what was fascinating to me, and this has happened to me on a couple occasions when I've done work on curriculum and standards, when I find something that is in the absence, it startles me. It may even take me weeks to realize that something has not been put in the story. And what is fascinating, if you go to Texas history in the state of Texas, which is startling to me, there is no reference to Juneteenth. So the truth is, the only way, and my wife and others have conceded to this, they learned about Juneteenth at Juneteenth celebrations. So in many ways, we are entering a different space where what we are at, questions that we are asked to raise, the topics we wish to explore, are being more censored in overt ways than I've ever seen. People often ask me questions about the topic related to critical race theory. And I say race wasn't there before they said it shouldn't be there. It's just now they're saying you can't do it, but it wasn't there before. So what these celebrations, that I would argue, serve as is a powerful conduit, a means of which to provide that knowledge, spaces that cannot be taken for granted. They're not merely places to have popcorn and hot dogs and barbecue, although I like all of those things and partake of them when I go to Juneteenth. But one of the things that I soon realized is that Juneteenth celebrations, or celebrations of any kind, whether it's Freedom Day in Los Angeles in the 80s, or it's Hyde Park Art Festival in the South Side of Chicago, or it's Harlem Week in New York, these spaces provide as Nancy Fraser calls, a counter-public space, a space in which ideas and ideology and identity come together and challenge the dominant narratives in powerful and expressive ways. And I hope we can continue to have a conversation about these topics for the remainder of today's presentation. But I conclude with the thought that to affirm that Juneteenth celebrations are not merely socializing events. They affirm the humanity of African Americans. They provide powerful knowledge about the experience of African Americans, and they provide a space in which students and young people are able to engage and express themselves in ways that they're often not able to in schools. Thank you.
Dr. Brown, I have a question. I apologize for my off video, but what have been your experiences or have individuals shared? Because I used to share what was so celebratory about Juneteenth when African Americans or Blacks learned about slavery 2 years later from everyone else. And then because I was in Ohio, and in Ohio they were celebrating like, well, first of all, y'all not from Texas. Second of all, what are you celebrating? Because they learned about it 2 years later, and it was purposely done and intentionally done. And so, what kind of what can you share about that? Because I felt that I was the only one, and when I got in Texas, then I was like, okay, I can see why I see this celebration, and they did all the parades and things, and it truly was a celebration of freedom. And yet, I still struggle with it, considering what you showed in that video about, are we really free when our lives are being taken and we are put in places of dominance of whiteness, and what does that feel like? So I wanted you to expound on that, if that's okay.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, one of the things, so if we know that celebrations are not merely spaces to just be joyous, they're spaces for us to converge on our issues. They're spaces for us to get people to register to vote. They're spaces for people to dance and express themselves in ways that often they were hostile to. So early part of the 20th century is where African Americans are engaging in, I mean, later after the Civil War, when African Americans are in these freedom celebrations, they came with a level of hostility. So freedom celebrations of these kinds serve as a form of agency in way in I think in many ways in Texas they were not merely just places to dance and sing and pray over this moment. They served multiple purposes, and I think that was the point. Even I say of this presentation is that if you go to a Juneteenth event, you realize there's so much more going on than simply memorializing or commemorating the signing or this information that was passed in 1865. June 19th also serves as a conduit to express issues of inequality, issues of, dependent on the time period, freedom celebrations of this kind provide, book vendors where information is passed. I would say that there's multiple usages of the freedom celebrations beyond merely remembering that moment. And and if you were to go to one this year, you would see that kind of complex activity, even the dissemination of art, the dissemination of information about goods and services, um, public service announcements. There's so much that goes into freedom celebrations of Juneteenth. They don't merely serve as remembering of that moment. And I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
So, you shared the images of anti-Blackness and centering whiteness within the school books. Um, can you speak to how it still exists, or has it gotten better? Is it just as bad? Has the narrative changed, but the substance, the outside, but maybe the internal aspects, the hidden messages are the same? So how has it changed over time?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll give you an example. Carefulin Brown and I did a study of fifth, eighth, and 10th grade history textbooks. A colleague asked us, how is racial violence depicted in textbooks? And we were like, we weren't sure. So we studied it. And what we found interestingly is there's several layers of description of violence found in it. But we found something really interesting that I think is indicative of the ways that race and inclusion occur in textbooks now. The story of racial violence now is often depicted as what we call bad men doing bad things. The violence itself is not attached to the state. There's no institutions. It's removed of institutions. It's just simply bad actors. And I think about the pedagogical or curricular moment where students read this it's very easy for them to disavow its significance because it's a moment in time. It's an aberration in American narrative. So I would say that you have these forms of inclusion, but they're limited, and they're very easily read as that was just evil individuals, uneducated Southerners who engaged in this kind of negative racial violence, but it's not a depiction of what America really is. So that was one way. And of course, there's simple, like this kind of inclusion where there's really no substance to the story. Uh, do we see happy slaves? Sometimes you get some of that, but I think you could see the changes hold in place the idea of white dominance and the exclusion of blackness, but in very different ways over time. I would say it's still there, but in different ways. Now we're very overt. We're telling you you can't study this, and we're having. I mean, this is fascinating to me. Watch states, all engaging in this critical race theory as a way in which to censor what can be taught in schools. So maybe we are moving to a form of racial exclusion that we saw in the early 20th century, which is fascinating to me. So we'll see if it'll reflect in the new textbook adoptions. This, these laws, will they impact the way students learn about the experiences of African Americans? So how can you talk about lynching? How can you talk about segregation? How can you talk about slavery without talking about race? It almost seems an absurd act. I
Thank
see
you.
a hand up.
Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. I was also struck by those by the anti-Black image making in children's texts, and that the creation of racial knowledge in a pedagogical setting just starts sparking different ideas for me about different kinds of research I could do. My area is New Testament, early Christianity, Christian origins. And it made me start thinking, well, we could go back to children's Bibles and start looking for the way racial imagery comes up as in those settings. But my comment is more, I'm wondering about at the university level, are there any projects going on with looking at UT and its history of publications and the way we participated in that kind of image making?
Yeah, I, as the chair of faculty council, I assembled a task force with the help of Ted Gordon. So we have a commemoration committee that is trying to, we have funding attached to it, research panels, but it's just getting started. In fact, we had our first few meetings this last semester, but I would say, in fact, what I could do, if you send me an email, I could give you the website because it could kind of lays out our whole project that tries to map what at a textual level, and even in terms of even changing the narrative of how the kind of outward depictions of Texas are reflected historically, but even how do we address those absences in the present? That's the one that stands out to me. I mean, it's comes out of the tower, um, and that's the one that stands out for me the most. I mean, and it's surprisingly funded.
Dr. Brown, I'm glad you brought up the CRT. I heard Dr. Kaplan Brown speak on CRT and curriculum and the legislation that was up to erase that from the schools, which to me was a duplicate legislation that was mirroring what Trump had put in place in regards to diversity and all of those things of erasing and talking about oppressions and white privilege. And so I'm glad you did bring that up. So I would say to you, how do we move forward? I don't know where that legislation landed. I don't know if we ran out of time or did it make its way through? I'm not sure. But if it did make its way through and schools are required to do that at the K through 12, because I heard that they tried to implement it at the higher ed level and it got squashed. before it could come forth. So can you talk a little bit about that and how that is another issue to be talked about when we're talking about Juneteenth?
Gosh, it did get through, it did pass. We're not sure what will be the implications of it. I do think educating teachers about the policy is going to be key because there's the way the policy is written suggests that schools can't force a teacher to learn or teach about race or critical race theory or this idea of presenting one group as superior to another, which is never stated within most of the racial discourse that happens in schools, including in the critical legal studies of critical race theory in particular. So I think really giving people an opportunity to read the policy and understand what does it mean in terms of teaching. It doesn't mean you get fired, but the problem is the way the narrative is presented, new teachers will interpret it that way. So I think it will take persons such as myself that prepare teachers in the College of Education say, let's read the policy, let's understand what the policy is and see how it works in relation to your work. What are the implications of it? I think those barriers have always been there. And there's always had to be a kind of navigating or implicit way that teachers have had to engage these kinds of questions. And we have to prepare teachers to now exist prior to this kind of outward rejection of multiculturalism or critical race theory, the rejection came by way of it not being present. So when you look at all of the state standards, racism doesn't even exist within state standards. I wrote a paper with a couple colleagues of mine. It was published in 2010, and the term racism doesn't even exist. So to now suggest that we're telling you can't study it is almost comical because it wasn't there before in any form. There was no substance to the work. I think we also have to educate families and communities around these issues. If you educate families and communities, this is the work that AISD, and I know other districts are doing, is trying to set what is critical race theory, what is it not, what are the implications to teachers, and not allow the myth to, there's a body of work that looks at controversial issues, and what they find out is that the thing that teachers presume is controversial and the outcomes of that controversy and that topic is usually inaccurate. There's nothing that would allow them to be fired, but their interpretation of that work, whether it's gay rights, LGBTQ issues in schools, whether it's religion in schools, there's certain topics that certainly in certain communities will put you at greater risk, but there's nothing within the policy that would fire you from teaching that topic, but it gets interpreted in that way. So I think key to this will be to educate teachers about the policy itself, and even recognizing it wasn't there before. We've always had to navigate this kind of process of delimiting what racial questions could be explored. We're just in a different moment where it's expressed. I think this idea that, oh, we can't teach it anymore. Well, they weren't allowing you to teach it prior to that because there's other subtle ways in which you get. So when you tie certain topics to test, and race is not engaged in the test, teachers are only going to teach those things that are high stakes. So high stakes testing is an institutional way in which to not teach race that in my belief system is more powerful than simply saying you can't teach race, because it's more implicit. It's like, it's not that you can't teach race, but you have to teach the test or you'll get fired. And in some cases, test scores and merit, those things are tied together. So on default, teachers will only teach about those things that are seen as deemed most valuable in the context of the STAR test.
Sarah, you had your hand up and then you lowered it. Did your question get answered?
Yeah, my question got answered. It was about how the critical race theory ban affects instruction. So,
okay.
Thank you.
Sure. Gautami?
Well, first, I'd like to thank you for a wonderful presentation. I learned so much in this. And we've been talking about K-12, but I was wondering also at the university level, because a lot of our students are pretty ignorant. Let's be honest about it. And we are at COLA, liberal arts. So how do we ensure that at COLA, we at least make sure our students who are going through a COLA curriculum come out? For example, I teach Hindi largely and South Asian literature when I have time, and popular culture. But I realized this past year when I have been trying to draw in and be a little more inclusive, information that I would normally not have had. We do current affairs every time, but this time I was very focused. And a lot of my students at the end were, wow, well, we knew about Black Lives Matter, but we didn't know the history behind it, because they had to do projects, which was not only on Black Lives Matter, whatever they wanted to do, but draw in current history, current affairs, and then go back historically to see what's happening. So how do we ensure that? I think in COLA, we are in a better position to, should we have something in our core curriculum that all COLA students, they're coming from a K-12 system, which doesn't teach them about critical race theory. So how can we do it? I don't know. But do you have any ideas and suggestions?
I hope this doesn't come across as simplistic, but I think I've realized this serving as chair of faculty council. It's about desire. If the College of Liberal Arts wants to do a thorough assessment of topics related to any area, let's just say it's dealing with bias and race, they'll look at their catalog and see what courses and what professors have access to that, and then provide a vehicle for which students can gain credit. Because the issues oftentimes, I would love to take that class on race, but it doesn't go to my degree in economics. So if the actual institution itself has the desire to privilege certain questions as important, race may be one of many. I think it's a very simplistic way or linear way to address the issue. Increase the number of courses that are available and give undergraduates the flexibility to take those courses, because we value them as important, regardless of whether you're in American studies or Black studies or economics. We say this body of knowledge is valuable and important. And the college itself or the university will organize itself around those issues. I mean, I think it's really about a desire to address it. Now, I know we have academic freedom and we have, there's so many issues that can delimit what we can do. You can't mandate, say, Anthony Brown, you have to teach this class. I think we have enough of us that are engaged in these topics and informed by these questions. I think it just would take the college or the university itself to say, this body of knowledge is of great value. I mean, I teach a signature course, but I reach 18 students, and I've taught the class maybe 13 times. So I haven't even reached 200 students over a decade. And I could say, from my personal experience, we spent 15 weeks with the hardest topics around race. And I hit hard, but it's a thesis-driven course. I ask one simple question. At the beginning of the course, I say, race is, what does this mean? Race is a social construct that has real material consequences. And they're usually all over the place with that question. They come back to that question later in the semester, and they're able to take the knowledge they gain from the course to engage that question in very powerful ways. There's very little resistance, few African Americans, mostly white, mostly not in COLA. I've had semesters where I had all electrical engineer majors, maybe one economics major. So no humanities, no liberal arts in a race class, and they absorbed it. They couldn't get enough of it. And I'm not gentle with the topic. It's sometimes harsh. My trauma-informed colleagues have educated me about understanding how to teach this in ways. I actually was a chair of a task force last year, and it is important to address these issues. I just think if we have the desire to do it, we'll do it. But oftentimes we don't, because we have other projects and other interests. So what ends up happening is it's there. We probably could we could name hundreds of faculty that address these questions, but they're all over the place. There's nothing that would require a student to engage those questions unless you just It's ad hoc. You just happen to take a class with Anthony Brown because he was the UGS course during the time that you wanted to take it. But there's nothing institutionalized about them gaining that knowledge. But you get to the end of the journey and you're like, wow. But it's luck of the draw, or the timing of the class. Because that's usually what I get. I mean, lately, though, since the whole Black Lives Matter and things, George Floyd, this semester, students came to my class with questions. Rather than it was the time the class, or it's a 3 hour course and I like that it's that or it's on Wednesdays, which I typically get with my UGS courses. This semester it was everything that happened this summer. I felt that this course can answer my questions.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. There was a question that was sent to me. Asking a question for a friend who isn't here. She teaches middle school history. What resources are there in Austin, support groups, advisors for K-12 teachers who teach about race and racism and have to deal with negative feedback from parents? Sometimes their administrators are not effective in standing up for them.
Send me an email and I could get you part of a group. I can't remember one of them. The person that's over the group used to be one of my students, so I could get you connected to that group and several others. Let me go ahead and put my email in the chat.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Friends at middle school will be so grateful.
yeah, just reach out to me and I'll do the best I can. But I know there's a group. I just can't remember their name. ALB at Austin.edu. I think that's it. I don't. Yeah, there we go. Dr. Pike, is there a way for this group to get my emails where I can just get it to everyone? I don't want
Yes, we can definitely
yeah.
send that out.
I'll take care of that. There it is. I
There
sent
it is.
it. Yeah, there we go.
I want to thank you again. This has been very enlightening for me, and I'm sure everyone who's listening to this. And so I appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to share your wisdom and expertise with us. Thank you.
I just want to thank all of you for having me this opportunity. This was a great conversation, and if those that didn't have an opportunity to ask me questions, I'm around. I'm here all summer. You feel free to email me, reach out to me if you have further questions that you couldn't ask here. But thank you all for this opportunity.